The message arrived on every major world in the Galactic Union, at the same time, stamped with the highest priority seal that Ambassador Kat Druvan had ever used in his long career as a diplomat. It read simply, Emergency Linguistic Summit, Thesara Prime. All qualified xenolinguists report immediately. And so they came from every corner of the galaxy, the greatest language scholars alive, preachers who had spent their entire lives buried in ancient texts and dead scripts and forgotten tongues that no living mouth had spoken in thousands of years. They gathered in the grand linguistic vault of Thesara Prime, a building so old that nobody was entirely sure who had built it first, though the Thesarans had claimed it, and filled it with the largest collection of dead languages ever assembled under one roof. The vault's central hall was enormous, with ceilings that stretched up into shadow, and walls lined with crystal data slabs that hummed faintly with stored knowledge. And in the middle of it all stood Archon Selthari Quen, the most respected linguist in the known galaxy. Selthari was Thesaron, an insectoid being with 4 slender arms, and wings that shimmered like oil on water when light hit them at the right angle. And he had spent 47 years of his life studying one language and one language only. Vorath K, the language of the Vorath, a species that had vanished from the universe 40,000 years ago, and left behind ruins and technology and inscriptions that nobody could fully read, because their language was so complex and so deeply tied to their biology that even the best scholars could only manage fragments. Selthari could translate roughly 35% of the known Vorath texts, and that made him the best in the galaxy, and he was very aware of this fact. He stood at the front of the hall, with his wings folded tight against his back, and addressed the assembled scholars with the calm authority of someone who had earned every word he spoke. 3 weeks ago, he said, a survey team discovered a new Vorath ruin on the 4th moon of Dressa 7, and the inscriptions inside are extensive, more extensive than anything we have found before. A murmur rippled through the crowd. However, Selthari continued, the inscriptions are written in a dialectal variant of Vorath K that I have never encountered, and I must be honest with you, I cannot read it. A murmur became a rumble, because if Selthari could not read it, then nobody in the room could read it either. Ambassador Kef stepped forward. Then a tall reptilian Druvan with dark green scales and golden eyes that never seemed to blink, and his voice cut through the noise like a blade. The 4th moon of Dressa 7 is in orbital decay, he said flatly, and our projections show it will be pulled apart by the gas giant's gravity in approximately 4 months. So whatever is in that ruin, whatever knowledge the Vorath left behind, we have 4 months to extract it, or it is gone forever. Selthari nodded his triangular head slowly. To achieve working fluency in this new dialect, he said, I estimate it would take a dedicated team of our best scholars between 20 and 30 years. The room went silent, and in that silence you could feel the weight of something precious slipping away, like sand through fingers that could not close fast enough. Kef's jaw tightened, and for a moment even his diplomatic composure cracked, and he looked like what he was, a man watching an impossible situation get worse. That was when the door at the back of the hall opened. Every head turned, every eye and sensor and antennae shifted, and they saw a human woman walking in with a duffel bag over one shoulder, and a cup of something hot and dark in her free hand, and she was smiling like someone who had just arrived at a party, and was very glad to be there. Her name was Dr. Lyra Voss. She was 32 years old, and she was a xenolinguist from Earth, which meant she was from a species that most of the galaxy still considered to be newcomers who were far too loud and far too confident for their own good. She had brown hair pulled back in a messy knot, and dark circles under her eyes that suggested she had not slept on the transport ship, and as she walked down the central aisle of the vault, her neural implant chimed softly in her ear with a sound that only she could hear. It was her Duo-Lingo app, the Xeno edition, a far-future descendant of an ancient Earth language learning program that had survived centuries because humans simply refused to let it die. The app's holographic mascot, a small glowing bird with two large eyes and a vaguely threatening smile, appeared in the corner of her vision and chirped, "You are on a 1,847-day streak. Do not break it now," flicked the notification away, and dropped her bag on the nearest table, with a thud that made two Thessaran scholars flinch. "Sorry I am late," she said to the room at large. "Transport from Sol Sector got delayed. What did I miss?" Selthari stared at her with all four of his compound eyes. "We were discussing," he said with the careful patience of someone who was already annoyed, "the impossibility of translating a newly discovered Vorath Key dialect within the time we have available." Lyra took a sip of her drink. "Right," she said. "The moon that is falling apart. I read the briefing on the way here." She set down her cup and walked to the central display, where the first images of the ruins' inscriptions were projected in pale blue light, and she studied them for a long, quiet moment, her head tilted slightly to one side, like a bird examining something shiny. The assembled scholars watched her, some with curiosity, some with irritation, then a few with the particular kind of doubt that the galaxy's older species always seemed to have when a human got involved in serious academic work. Lyra turned back to the room. "Give me 3 months," she said. The silence that followed was so complete that you could hear the data slabs humming in the walls. Then the room exploded. Selthari's wings snapped open, a Thessaron sign of shock and anger, and his voice rose above the chaos with a sharpness that surprised even him. 3 months, he repeated. "I have spent 47 years on this language, and you stand there and tell me you will do in 3 months what I could not do in a lifetime." Lyra held up both hands. "I am not saying I will do what you did," she said calmly. "I am saying I will do something different. You built the foundation, and I am going to sprint on top of it." "This is arrogance," said a Veldari scholar from the back row, a gelatinous being whose body pulsed with bioluminescent fury. "This is insanity," agreed a Kreth mathematician whose entire species communicated in precise logical structures and found human behavior deeply upsetting on a fundamental level. Ambassador Keth raised one clawed hand, and the room slowly quieted. He looked at Lyra for a long moment with those unblinking golden eyes, and she looked right back, and whatever he saw in her face was enough. "You have your 3 months, Dr. Voss," he said. Selthari made a sound that in his language had no polite translation. Lyra just smiled and turned to her duffel bag and began unpacking. A portable cot, a blanket, 6 bags of Earth coffee, a data tablet, and a small holographic projector for her Duo-Lingo interface. She set up the cot right there in the vault, right next to the ancient crystal slabs that held the last whispers of a dead civilization. And she cracked her knuckles and said to her app, "New language, Vorath K dialectal variant. Load everything we have, and build me a course." The little glowing bird blinked at her, and then its eyes narrowed with what could only be described as excitement. "No existing course available," it said. "Generating custom curriculum from all accessible data. Estimated completion time, 94 days. Beginning Lesson 1. On the first day, Lyra got almost everything wrong, and she did not care even a little bit. She sat cross-legged on the floor of the vault, surrounded by holographic Vorath glyphs, and she spoke them aloud one after another, mangling the pronunciation so badly that a Thessaran archivist passing by actually stopped walking and pressed 2 of his 4 hands over his auditory membranes in what could only be described as physical pain. "That is not how that sound is produced," Selthari said from across the room, where he had been watching with the horrified fascination of someone witnessing a slow-motion collision. "I know," Lyra said cheerfully, and then she said it wrong again, but slightly less wrong this time. This was the thing about Lyra Voss that drove every alien scholar in the vault absolutely out of their minds. She was not afraid to fail, and she was not afraid to fail loudly and publicly and repeatedly. And she treated every single failure as useful information rather than as something to be ashamed of. The other scholars did not work this way. The Thesserons approached language the way a surgeon approaches a body, with precision and reverence and an almost religious respect for structure, and they would not speak a word until they were certain they understood its grammar and its history and its place in the larger system. The Veldari used mathematical modeling, building vast equations that mapped phonetic relationships and syntactic patterns, and they could spend years refining a single model before producing a single translated sentence. The Kreth used pure logic, constructing argument chains that proved what a word must mean based on its context and its structural relationship to other words. And their work was beautiful and rigorous and extraordinarily slow. Lyra used sticky notes. She labeled everything in the vault with handwritten Vorath K sticky notes. The tables, the chairs, the walls, the data slabs, the coffee machine she had brought from the ship, even Selthari himself, who discovered a small yellow note stuck to his back that read, "Grumpy Teacher," in shaky Vorath glyphs. He removed it with great dignity and said nothing, but his wings twitched in a way that Lyra had already learned meant he was trying not to laugh. By the end of the first week, she was thinking in fragments of Vorath K, mixing it into her English in ways that confused everyone around her. And her Duo-Lingo app was feeding her micro-lessons every 20 minutes without mercy. The app had built an entire custom course from the available Vorath K data, Selthari's published translations, the archived inscriptions, the phonetic reconstructions that other scholars had produced over decades, and it had turned all of that serious academic work into bite-sized gamified chunks. Lyra earned experience points for every correct translation and lost hearts for every mistake. Little holographic bird mascot tracked her progress with an intensity that bordered on surveillance. "You have not practiced in 18 minutes, it said at one point while she was eating lunch. "I am eating," she said. "Your streak does not eat," it replied, and its eyes glowed red for just a moment. She put down her food and opened the next lesson. A young Thesseron researcher named Pillock watched all of this with enormous curiosity, because unlike the older scholars, Pillock had not yet developed the automatic skepticism that most aliens felt toward human methods. And one evening when the vault was quiet and most of the other scholars had gone to their quarters, Pillock sat down next to Lyra and asked the question that everyone else was too proud to ask. "How do you learn so fast when you understand so little?" Lyra looked up from her tablet, where she had been running flashcard drills, and she smiled in a tired way that made her look older than 32. "Do you know what Hebrew is?" she asked. Pillock did not. "It was a language on Earth," Lyra said, "a very old one, and for about 1700 years nobody really spoke it as a daily language. It was kept alive in religious texts and by scholars, but it was not a living language anymore." She pulled up a historical file on her tablet. Then in the late 1800s, a man named Eliezer ben Yehuda decided he was going to bring it back, and people told him it was impossible, because you cannot resurrect a dead language. But he did it, and within a few generations millions of people were speaking it as their first language. Pillock's antennae twitched. "One human decided to undo 1700 years of linguistic death," Pillock said slowly. "And he was not even the most impressive example," Lyra said, "because before that, a man named Jean-François Champollion decoded Egyptian hieroglyphics, a writing system that had been unreadable for over 1,000 years. And he did it in his 20s. And he did it because he was obsessed." She leaned forward. "That is the secret, Pillock. Humans do not learn languages the way your people do. We do not approach them as puzzles to be solved with patience and precision. We approach them the way we approach everything. We throw ourselves in head first, and we drown a little, and we figure out how to swim. Pillock considered this. That sounds deeply inefficient, they said. Oh, it is, Lyra agreed. It is so inefficient that it circles all the way back around to being efficient again. Because while your scholars are building perfect models of a language they cannot speak, I am out here speaking it badly and getting better every single day. She was not exaggerating. By the end of week 2, her error rate on basic translations had dropped by 40%, and by the end of week 3, she was producing partial translations of the new dialects inscriptions that were rough and imperfect, but recognizably correct. By week 4, she did something that changed the entire atmosphere in the vault. She translated a passage that Salthari had been working on for 3 days, and she did it in 2 hours, and she got one detail right that he had gotten wrong. A verb form that he had interpreted as passive, but which Lyra identified as reflexive, based on a pattern she had noticed in the way the dialect handled emotional states. Salthari checked her work, and then checked it again, and then sat very still for a long time, with his wings pressed flat against his back, which Lyra had learned was the Thesseron equivalent of a human going pale. This is correct, he said quietly. Yeah, Lyra said, and she had the good sense not to gloat. But the damage was done, and everyone in the vault knew it, because a human with a language app and 3.5 weeks of study had just corrected the foremost Vorath K scholar in the galaxy on a point of grammar, and the worst part was that she had not done it through genius or luck, but through sheer relentless repetitive exposure, through doing the same drills 1,000 times, until patterns emerged that no amount of careful analysis had revealed. Salthari did not speak to her for 2 days after that. He went back to his own workstation, and he sat among his 47 years of notes, and he felt something he had never felt before in his long and decorated career. It was not anger exactly, though anger was part of it. It was the cold, sharp realization that there was more than one way to climb a mountain, and that his way, careful and measured and dignified as it was, might not be the fastest way to the top. He looked across the vault at Lyra, who was arguing with her Duo-Lingo bird about whether she deserved bonus points for translating while half asleep. And he thought about all the years he had spent, and all the years he had left, and he wondered if perhaps the universe was trying to teach him something about the difference between patience and stubbornness. It happened in week 6, and it hit her like a wall made of glass, invisible until she slammed into it, and then suddenly everywhere, sharp and cold and impossible to get past. The dialectal variant of Vorath K had a feature that standard Vorath K did not have, and it was this feature that had stopped every scholar dead in their tracks for decades, without any of them fully understanding why. The language shifted meaning based on the emotional state of the speaker, not in the way that human languages could carry emotion through tone or emphasis. This was structural, baked into the grammar itself, so that the same sentence spoken in grief meant something entirely different from the same sentence spoken in joy, and the difference was not poetic or metaphorical, but literal. A word that meant sky when spoken calmly meant burial when spoken in sorrow. A phrase that meant I walk forward in a state of hope meant I am being erased in a state of fear. It was as if the Vorath who spoke this dialect did not separate thought from feeling the way other species did. To them, emotion was not something layered on top of language, but something woven into the very fabric of it, so that you could not say anything without also saying how you felt about it. And Lyra could not crack it. She tried for 9 straight days, and she got nowhere, and the frustration built inside her like pressure in a sealed container, until she started snapping at people who did not deserve it, and staying awake for stretches that were not healthy, and forgetting to eat until her hands shook. Her Duo-Lingo app noticed, "Your performance has dropped 23% in the last 4 days, the little bird said one morning, as she stared at a wall of inscriptions that refused to make sense. Would you like to review earlier lessons to rebuild confidence? No, she said. Your streak is at 1,889 days, the bird said. It would be a shame if something happened to it. Are you threatening me? She said. The bird blinked its two large eyes and said nothing, which was somehow worse. On the 10th day of her struggle, Sci-Fi came to her workstation, and he stood there for a moment, with his forearms folded, and his wings held low in the Thesaron posture of someone who is about to do something that costs them their pride. I encountered this same barrier, he said, 11 years into my study of Vorath K. Lyra looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. It took me a decade to move past it, he said, but I did eventually develop a partial framework for understanding the emotional markers, and my notes from that period may be useful to you. He held out a data crystal. Lyra stared at it, and then she stared at him, and she understood what this was costing him. This was the greatest Vorath K scholar in the galaxy offering his life's work. Work to a human who had been studying his language for 6 weeks. And he was doing it not because he liked her or approved of her methods, but because the moon was falling and the knowledge inside it mattered more than his pride. She took the crystal. Thank you, Archon, she said, and she meant it completely. Do not call me Archon, he said. My students call me Sci-Fi, and I suppose at this point you qualify, though it pains me to admit it. Something shifted between them after that. It was not friendship exactly, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that might become friendship if given enough time. A mutual recognition between two very different minds that they were both in love with the same thing, even if they loved it in different ways. Sci-Fi's notes were extraordinary. They were meticulous and detailed, and they contained insights that he had never published because he had never been confident enough in them to share with them. Academic community, and when Lyra fed them into her Duo-Lingo system alongside the inscription data, the app began generating new pattern models that neither of them could have produced alone. Sci-Fi provided the depth, decades of careful analysis and intuition built word by word over a lifetime of study. Lyra provided the speed, the ability to take raw data and process it through sheer repetitive immersion until patterns leaped out that no amount of careful thinking would reveal. Together, they were terrifying. They worked side by side in the vault for hours that stretched into days, and the other scholars watched from a distance with the uncomfortable feeling that they were witnessing something historic and slightly unfair. It was in the middle of week 8 that the breakthrough came. Lyra had been staring at a sequence of emotional markers that appeared throughout the new dialect's inscriptions, trying to find the pattern that connected them. She had arranged them on a holographic display in chronological order, based on their position in the ruin, and suddenly she saw it. She saw it the way you sometimes see a face in the clouds, all at once, complete, obvious, impossible to unsee. Sci-Fi, she said, and her voice was very quiet and very steady in the way that meant something enormous was happening inside her head. He came to her station and looked at the display. The emotional markers are not random, she said, and they are not based on the content of what is being said. They are based on the age of the speaker. She pointed to the earliest inscriptions. These ones have markers associated with curiosity and confusion and excitement, young emotions, learning emotions. She pointed to the middle sections. These shift to markers of loneliness and determination and grief. She pointed to the final inscriptions. And these are, I do not have a word for it. The emotional signature of someone who has accepted something enormous and terrible and has decided to keep going anyway. Sci-Fi's wings went very still. The inscriptions are not a technical document, Lyra said. They are not directions to a weapons cache. They are a story, Sci-Fi, a coming-of-age story, written by a single Vorath over the course of what might have been their entire life. She turned to face him, and her eyes were bright and wet. A person wrote this, she said. A young person, I think. Someone who was growing up and learning and hurting and hoping and they wrote it on the walls of that ruin because they needed someone to hear them. Sci-Fi looked at the display for a very long time. He looked at the patterns she had identified, and he checked them against his own knowledge, and he felt the careful structures of his understanding rearrange themselves into something new and larger and more beautiful than what had been there before. In 47 years, he said slowly, I never saw this. Lyra shook her head. You were looking at it like a puzzle, she said gently. I was looking at it like a person wrote it, because that is how humans look at everything. We always look for the person first. The vault was very quiet. Then her Duo-Lingo app chimed with a bright, cheerful sound that completely shattered the moment. Congratulations, the little bird announced. You have unlocked Vorath K Emotional Tier 2. 500 experience points bonus. Would you like to continue to Tier 3? Lyra laughed. A real laugh. The kind that comes from somewhere deep. And Sci-Fi made a sound that Lyra had never heard from him before. It was a Thesseron laugh. Tell your ridiculous bird, he said, that yes, we would very much like to continue to Tier 3. Lyra grinned and wiped her eyes and pressed the button. And the work continued. Was different. Because now they knew what they were reading. Not a manual, not a map, not a weapon, but a voice reaching out across 40,000 years of silence, hoping against all reason that someone would be there to listen. And two very different scholars, working in two very different ways, had heard it. The fourth moon of Dressa 7 was dying, and you could see it happening in real time if you looked out the window of the transport ship. Great cracks ran across the moon's surface like veins of fire, and pieces of rock the size of cities were breaking away and drifting upward into the crushing gravity of the gas giant above. And the whole world shook with a low, constant tremor that you felt in your teeth and in your bones, and in some deep animal part of your brain that knew this was a place that did not want you to be here. The transport landed on a crumbling plateau 300 meters from the ruin's entrance, and the pilot told them they had 72 hours at most before the tidal forces would make the surface unnavigable. 72 hours, Ambassador Keth repeated as he stepped off the ramp, his golden eyes scanning the hellscape around them. Then we leave, with or without what we came for. The team was small because there had been no time to assemble anything larger. Lyra, Sci-Fi, Keth, and a squad of 6 Union soldiers in heavy armor who were there to keep them alive long enough to do their work. Sci-Fi moved slowly because his species was not built for rough terrain, and the constant trembling of the ground made his 4 legs unsteady. But he refused to stay behind, and Lyra had not tried to make him because she knew they needed each other for what was coming. They reached the entrance of the ruin, and Lyra felt her breath catch. It was enormous, a doorway carved into the bedrock of the moon that rose 30 meters high and was covered from top to bottom in Vorath inscriptions that glowed faintly with a bioluminescent residue that had somehow survived 40,000 years. Oh, she whispered. Even Keth, who was not a man given to wonder, stood still for a moment. Sci-Fi's wings opened slightly, a Thesseran expression of awe, and he reached out with one of his 4 hands and touched the wall beside the entrance, and his fingers trembled. I have waited my entire life to stand here, he said. Then let us not waste it, Lyra said, and she stepped inside. The interior of the ruin was vast and dark and alive with inscriptions. Every wall, every pillar, every surface was covered in the flowing script of Vorath K, and as Lyra's light swept across them, the bioluminescent residue responded to the energy and began to glow brighter, as if the words themselves were waking up after a very long sleep. Lyra activated her recording equipment and her Duo-Lingo app simultaneously, and she began to read. She read aloud, her voice steady and clear in the trembling darkness, and the words of the Vorath dialect came out of her mouth with a fluency that would have been unthinkable 3 months ago. Not perfect, not elegant, but real and living and functional. Sci-Fi walked beside her and translated the formal passages, the ones written in standard Vorath K. That framed the dialect text like borders around a painting, and between the two of them, they moved through the ruin like a single creature with two minds. The story on the walls unfolded as they went deeper. It was the story of a Vorath named Kuoharin. Kuoharin had been young, very young by Vorath standards, when the Great Change came. And the inscriptions described that change in language so beautiful and so precise that even in translation it made Lyra's chest ache. The Vorath had not been destroyed. They had not been conquered or killed by war or disease or any of the usual things that ended civilizations. They had chosen to leave. The inscriptions described a transcendence, a collective decision by the entire Vorath species to shed their physical forms and become something else, something beyond matter and energy and time, something that the dialect described with an emotional marker that Lyra had never encountered before and which she could not put words to, only translate as the joy that lives on the other side of everything. But Kuoharin had been too young. The transcendence required a maturity of consciousness that Kuoharin had not yet reached, and so, when every other Vorath in the universe stepped beyond the boundary of physical existence, Kuoharin was left behind, alone, the last physical Vorath in the universe. Lyra's voice cracked as she read the passage where Kuoharin described the silence that followed. Not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of an empty species. The silence of being the only one of your kind in a universe that suddenly had no place for you. "Keep going," Sci-Fi said softly, and his voice was not steady either. They went deeper into the ruin, and the ground shook harder, and dust fell from the ceiling, and the soldiers kept looking up nervously, but Lyra kept reading, and Sci-Fi kept translating, and the story kept unfolding. Up, alone, on a dying world with no one to speak to, and no one to hold, and no future that included another Vorath face. Kuoharin had decided to build something. Not for themselves, because there was nothing left for themselves, but for whoever came next. The weapons cache that the Union had detected was not a weapons cache at all. It was a gift. Kuoharin had spent what must have been decades, alone, always alone, gathering everything the Vorath had been and storing it in a central data core at the heart of the ruin. Their music, their art, their science, their philosophy, their stories, their jokes, their recipes, their songs, their arguments, their love letters, their children's games, everything. A civilization compressed into a single point of light, so that even though the Vorath were gone, they would not be forgotten. The ground lurched violently, and a section of the ceiling collapsed 20 meters behind them. And Keth's voice crackled over the communication link. "We are running out of time. The surface is breaking apart faster than projected. Prelance, we are almost at the central chamber," Lyra called back. "You have 30 minutes, Keth said, and his voice left no room for negotiation. They ran. Sci-Fi stumbled on the uneven ground, and a chunk of falling stone struck his right shoulder, and Lyra heard the crack, even over the roar of the collapsing moon, and he went down hard. She was at his side in a second. "My arm," he said through clenched mandibles. "I think it is broken." "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then we keep going." She pulled him up, and he leaned on her, and they kept moving, and she kept reading the walls as they ran, her eyes scanning the inscriptions, and her mouth producing translations, and her Duo-Lingo app running real-time linguistic parsing in the background, cataloging grammar structures and vocabulary faster than any organic mind could manage. Reached the central chamber. It was a circular room, smaller than Lyra expected, and in its center sat a crystalline structure about the size of a human torso, the data core, and it was dark and silent and waiting. The walls of the chamber were covered in the final inscriptions, and Lyra read them, and felt tears running down her face, because Ku-Urin's last words were written in an emotional register that combined grief and hope and love in a way that no human language had ever managed to express. Selthari leaned against the wall, clutching his broken arm, and he read the inscriptions too, and his wings shivered, and he made no effort to hide what he was feeling. "There is an activation phrase," he said, pointing with one of his uninjured arms. "The core requires a spoken key." Lyra looked at the inscription he indicated, and she translated it, and she understood immediately why no machine and no dispassionate scholar would ever be able to activate this. Core. The phrase had to be spoken in the emotional dialect, and it had to be spoken with genuine feeling, specifically with the emotional marker for grief that contains hope. The feeling of losing everything, and still believing that something beautiful will come after. It could not be faked because the Vorath had built their technology to respond to authentic emotion, the way other species built technology to respond to passwords. Lyra stood in front of the core, and she thought about Ku-Urin, alone for decades in a universe that had moved on without them, building this gift with no guarantee that anyone would ever find it. She thought about what it meant to be the last of your kind and to choose hope anyway. She opened her mouth and she spoke the activation phrase in Vorath K, and she meant every sound of it. The grief was real, and the hope was real, and the love for a person she had never met, who had died 40,000 years ago, was as real as anything she had ever felt. The core lit up. Light poured out of it like sunrise, and filled the chamber, and for one brief, impossible moment, the walls sang, actually sang, in a voice that had not been heard in 40 millennia. Then the moon shook so hard that Lyra was thrown off her feet. "We go now," she said, and she grabbed the core with one arm and Selthari with the other, and they ran. They ran through collapsing corridors and over cracking floors, and past inscriptions that Lyra read even as she ran, because she could not bear to let a single word go unrecorded. They burst out of the ruin into a sky that was on fire with the reflected light of the gas giant. And the transport was already lifting off the crumbling plateau, and Keth was standing at the open ramp with his hand outstretched. Lyra threw the core to Keth, and then she threw Selthari to the soldiers, and then she jumped, and hands caught her and pulled her in, and the ramp closed, and the transport screamed upward into the sky. Behind them, the fourth moon of Dressa 7 tore itself apart in silence, and in Lyra's arms, the data core glowed with the light of everything the Vorath had ever been. 1 week later, the grand linguistic vault of Thesara Prime was more crowded than it had been in living memory, and the air buzzed with a kind of electric wonder that even the most jaded diplomats and scholars could not resist. The Vorath data core sat in the center of the main hall on a pedestal designed specifically for it, and it glowed with a soft, warm light that pulsed gently like a heartbeat. And around it gathered representatives from every major species in the Galactic Union. Ambassador Keth stood at the podium, and his voice carried across the hall with the weight of someone who understood that what he was about to say would be remembered for a very long time. "The data core recovered from the fourth moon of Dressa 7 has been opened," he said, "and its contents exceed anything we anticipated." He paused to let the silence build. "It contains the complete cultural archive of the Vorath civilization, 40,000 years of accumulated knowledge, including scientific discoveries that our best researchers say will take centuries to fully understand. Star maps to regions of the galaxy we have never explored. Mathematical frameworks that appear to unify fields of physics we currently treat as separate. And works of art and music and literature that represent perhaps the most significant cultural discovery in the history of the Galactic Union." The hall erupted in sound, gasps, and exclamations, and the alien equivalents of applause from dozens of species. And Keth let it go on for a moment before raising his hand for quiet. None of this would have been possible, he said, without the work of two individuals who proved that the greatest discoveries happen not when we work alone, but when very different minds choose to work together. He turned to the front row, where Lyra sat in a clean jacket, with her hair actually brushed for once, and where Selthari sat beside her, with his broken arm in a Thessaron medical brace, that hummed softly as it repaired his bones. Dr. Lyra Voss of Earth, Keth said, and Archon Selthari Quen of Thessara, please stand. They stood, and the hall gave them the kind of reception that neither of them had expected. Genuine, sustained, and thunderous in a way that made Lyra's ears ring, and made Selthari's wings flutter, with what she now knew was the Thessaran expression of overwhelmed gratitude. Keth began listing honors: the Union Medal of Discovery, the Thessaran Order of Knowledge, an honorary research grant that would fund their work for the rest of their lives. And Lyra stood there and smiled and waited until he was done, and then she stepped forward and did something that surprised everyone. She pointed at Selthari. "I need to say something," she said, and the hall quieted, because humans were unpredictable, and everyone wanted to see what this one would do next. "Everyone keeps talking about what I did," she said. "I really do, but I need you all to understand something. I did a sprint, a 3-month sprint, and it nearly broke me, and I could not have done it without a lot of coffee and a very aggressive language app." A few beings in the audience who had heard about the Duo-Lingo bird laughed. "But this man," she said, gesturing at Selthari, "spent 47 years keeping a dead language alive when nobody in the galaxy cared about it, when there was no funding and no glory and no urgent deadline. He did it because he believed it mattered, and he was right." She looked at him. "I sprinted the last mile," she said, "but he ran the marathon, and without the marathon there would have been no last mile to sprint." Selthari's wings opened slowly, not in shock or anger this time, but in something that Lyra had learned to recognize as the deepest form of Thessaran emotion, the one they rarely showed in public, the one that meant the heart was too full for the body too. He turned to face her, and he performed the bow, the low, slow, full-body bow that Thessarans reserved for the handful of moments in a lifetime when words were not enough. "And you reminded me why I started running," he said. The hall was very quiet, and Lyra realized that her eyes were wet again, and she decided she did not care. After the ceremony they sat together in a quiet corner of the vault, away from the crowds, and the diplomats, and the reporters who wanted interviews, and they drank tea, Thessaran tea, which tasted like warm rain and flowers, and they talked about the future. "A complete Voroth K dictionary and grammar," Selthari said, "covering both the standard language and the emotional dialect. It is the obvious next step." "How long do you think it will take?" Lyra asked. "Given the data in the core and our combined understanding, perhaps 20 years. Lyra grinned. "Bet I can cut that down," she said. Selthari made the sound that was his version of a laugh. "I am absolutely certain you will try," he said. They began planning that same evening, and within a week they had established a joint research program that brought together Thessaran rigor and human chaos in a way that made the academic establishment deeply uncomfortable and enormously productive. Word of the human method spread across the galaxy, and reactions were mixed in the way that reactions to anything humans did were always mixed. Half the galaxy thought it was brilliant, and the other half thought it was an affront to proper scholarship. And both halves were watching very carefully to see what happened next. A Veldari mathematician was spotted downloading a language learning app on her personal device, and when asked about it, she claimed it was for research purposes only, but her bioluminescence pattern suggested embarrassment. A Kreth logic master attended one of Lyra's public lectures on immersive language learning, and afterward he stood in the hallway for 20 minutes processing what he had heard, before saying to a colleague, "I believe the human may have identified an optimization pathway that our models failed to predict." And on Thessara Prime, A young archivist named Pillock, the same Pillock who had asked Lyra how she learned so fast when she understood so little, was seen maintaining a 200-day streak on a language app, studying an obscure trade pigeon from the Outer Rim territories. And when their supervisor asked why they were wasting time on such a thing, Pillock said, "I am not wasting time. I am drowning a little so that I can learn to swim." But all of that was noise, compared to what happened on a quiet night 3 weeks after the ceremony, when the vault was empty and dark, and Lyra sat alone at her workstation, with the data core glowing softly beside her. She had been reading Quo-Hurin's inscriptions, all of them. Very first clumsy childish markings, to the final words carved into the wall of the central chamber. And she had translated them completely, and she sat there in the blue-white light of the holographic display, and she read the very last thing the last Vorath had ever written. It was simple. It was in the emotional dialect, written with the marker for hope that knows it is irrational. The feeling of believing in something not because there is evidence, but because the alternative is unbearable. And it translated roughly to this: "If you are reading this, then I was not alone after all." Lyra sat very still. She thought about Quo-Hurin, young and frightened and abandoned by an entire species that had moved beyond the need for physical form, sitting in that ruin on a moon that was already beginning to die, carving words into stone, with no way of knowing if anyone would ever read them. She thought about what it took to do that, to build a gift for a sack, stranger you would never meet, to pour your entire civilization into a box of light and leave it in the dark, and hope. She thought about all the languages she had ever learned, and all the words she had ever spoken, and she knew that none of them had ever mattered as much as the words she was about to say. She leaned forward, and she spoke in Vorath K, in the emotional dialect, with the marker for grief that has become gratitude. And her pronunciation was not perfect, and her grammar was not flawless, but it was real, and it was true, and if Quo-Hurin had been there to hear it, they would have understood. "No," she said, "you were not." The data core pulsed once, a single bright flare of light that might have been a coincidence, and might have been something else entirely, and then it settled back to its gentle, steady glow. Lyra wiped her eyes and sat back and let out a long breath. Her Duo-Lingo app chimed. "Congratulations," the little bird said. For once, its voice sounded almost gentle. "Lesson complete. 2,000-day streak achieved. New language unlocked. Vorath key, archaic ceremonial variant. Would you like to begin?" Lyra laughed softly in the dark, empty vault, surrounded by the whispers of 1,000 dead languages, and the living glow of one civilization's final gift to the universe. She tapped the screen. "Yes," she said. And somewhere in the data core, in the deep archives where Quo-Hurin had stored everything the Vorath had ever been, a file that had been dormant for 40,000 years registered the presence of a reader for the first time. And if a data core could feel something like relief, something like the long, slow exhale of a soul that has been holding its breath for longer than most stars have been burning, then perhaps it did. Perhaps it did.